So Jane, this morning, those who have been online had a totally wonderful morning. And we should say, you and I, that we're going to do things a little bit differently. And I hope it's going to be almost equally wonderful. So first of all, Jane, you and I will be the first ones who participate today without a prepared PowerPoint presentation. So the pressure is on the both of us. And secondly, the way that all of the wonderful women have been presenting this morning is they have gone one presenter and then the other. And for those of us who are joining us this afternoon, Jane and I are going to be doing that a little bit differently. The topic that we have been assigned is transforming climate change and other global realities. So we thought it might be interesting to divide this conversation up into 3 sections. The first section that we wanted to share with you are both of our thoughts on global realities writ large. What are the big changes that have to be achieved over the next period of time? And how do they compare to other social and political changes that we have actually already succeeded at? And Jane is, of course, the person to speak about that. So we will both address that issue a little bit. Then we will both talk about a different level of the system, which is national and local efforts. What are we seeing? Jane will speak to the US reality and I'll speak to other realities, multinational realities. But what are we seeing on the ground from a national and local perspective? And thirdly, we wanted to end up with our internal reality, the groundwork that we need to go to, and we will both share with that. So in the understanding that what is present at one level of the system is present at all levels of the system, and that everything is interconnected, we thought we would take you through at least 3 levels, although, you know, you could have many others, but at least 3 levels, and share some thoughts at each of those 3 levels. So without much more ado, Jane, I would bow to you to speak about, you have been an activist for such a long time, and you have been an active participant in bringing about huge social and political changes. And I would just love to get maybe some reminiscing from you and some comparing and contrasting about what we have done in the past and achieved and where we are now on big ticket issues, big changes such as climate.
Thank you, Christiana. It's good to see you. And my love to Roshi, Joan Halifax, and hello to all of you everywhere around the world. I'm so honored to be part of this incredible group and humbled. You know, as I think about what you have just said, Christiana, I feel like it's the best of times and the worst of times. You know, over centuries, humans have had huge challenges to overcome: slavery, feudalism, the Inquisition. In my own lifetime, of course, there was the Vietnam War, voting for Black Americans, women's rights, LGBTQ rights. And while it took a lot of time, we didn't have cell phones then, those challenges were, for the most part, overcome. But today it feels very different. We have a truly existential threat hanging over all of us on the entire planet Earth. And I'm talking, of course, about the climate crisis. And we have very little time to get it right, as you know, Christiana, better than anyone. Scientists tell us that we only have 10 years to cut our carbon emissions in half and 20 more to phase out altogether. This is extremely difficult because so many of our economies have been based on fossil fuels. Already billions of species are becoming extinct. The ocean that provides us with 70% of our oxygen that we need to live, and that provides 30% of the protein for about 2 billion people, and the forests that provide the other 30% of our oxygen those beautiful forests that are home to indigenous people and so many untold species, these things are being destroyed. These are fundamental things that are needed for human life to survive on planet Earth. Sea levels are rising, extreme weathers are getting worse and more frequent, and so are health pandemics. And of course, democracies are being threatened in many countries by racist right-wing dictators who refuse to acknowledge the climate crisis. And I mean, humanity is basically is in grave danger, as is democracy. And this is different, I think, than ever before in human history. At the same time, and partly because of the young climate strikers who poured into the streets last fall all over the world by the millions, also more people are aware of the climate crisis because of the extreme weather events, and they're more aware of how interconnected things are. And so this is important because if we're not aware and we're not concerned, we can't do anything about it. The roots of all of those past challenges to humanity are interconnected in the present day crises, the climate crises, inequality, greed, racism, the capitalist mentality that sees a forest and thinks doors or flooring. These are all connected to the climate crisis. And with the COVID pandemic, white people in the United States are being made aware more than ever before of the extreme racial and class inequalities, realizing the terrible burdens carried by essential workers in the country who are mostly people of color, who are risking their lives every day unprotected to help people and also just to be able to pay their rent and buy food. And we're more than ever aware of how people of color are dying of respiratory illnesses and cancer because fossil fuel companies put their oil wells and their fracking pits and their refineries deliberately into communities of color. They call those communities sacrifice zones. And I'd like to quote a Black organizer. He's a climate organizer, Hop Hopkins. He said, you can't have climate change without sacrifice zones. And you can't have sacrifice zones without disposable people. And you can't have disposable people without racism. In other words, we can't end the climate crisis without ending racism. It's all connected, and more people, I believe, are starting to understand this. You know, and the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, captured up close by a bystander with a camera, has unleashed historic protests in the United States and other parts of the world. But here they've lasted for weeks and they continue, thank God. And there's unprecedented diversity among these protesters. And sometimes we see police kneeling with the protesters. And this is so important, as you know so well, Christiana. You said in your book, in your wonderful new book, The Future We Choose, Surviving the Climate Crisis, that's the name of her new book. And you've said, and I quote, history has shown that when approximately 3.5% of the population participates in nonviolent protests, success becomes inevitable. No nonviolent protest has ever failed to achieve its aim once it reaches that threshold of participation, close quote. I just love that. So, you know, the huge numbers that are in our streets every single day since the murder of George Floyd and the diversity of it gives me a lot of hope. You know, even here in California, there are small towns that have no Black residents at all, and yet you see white protesters of all ages carrying signs that say Black Lives Matter. I'd like to quote Lila Watson, who is an Australian Aboriginal artist, who said, quote, "If you have come here to save me, you're wasting your time. But if you have come here because you realize your liberation is bound up with mine, then let's work together," unquote. I feel that a growing number of people in this country are seeing that our liberations are bound together. And this is new, this is different. And even during the terrible upheavals caused by COVID-19, the pandemic that's happening, larger than ever percentages of Americans are still concerned about the climate crisis. We were worried that they'd forget about it, but they haven't. Our Fire Drill Fridays that I carry on every week are getting over 100,000 people watching every week, and hundreds are volunteering, even though we're doing it virtually online. And I believe that unprecedented numbers of people are prepared to take to the streets when that becomes safe again, in order to save our democracy and save our planet in November, when we have our critical election. So I'm optimistic.
Good, Jane. Because honestly, the most important election ever in history, and I think that is no exaggeration. Well, I would like to compliment Jane's very eloquent tour de force across everything that we're seeing right now. And as I was preparing for this, I got a little visual in one of the way too many social channels that reach us. And the visual, if I can describe it, had a group, not of children, but of adults standing on a beach, looking with their back to the ocean, looking toward the shore. And they were completely unaware that there were 3 waves coming at them. The first wave was entitled COVID-19 and was small. But the second wave, that was 2 times or 3 times as tall and as long, was entitled economic recovery. And the third wave, that was 10 times as tall and as long, was entitled climate change. That is the reality that Jane has just explained. That is the reality where all of this is interconnected, and we can't afford to focus on one thing, because all of this is coming at us basically at the same time. The one detail that little visual forgot is to include, and I would love to go and include it myself with my little crayon there, include the undercurrent that is under these 3 waves, which is social justice. Because the fact is that all of those 3 waves are definitely hitting us, but they're all accentuating social injustice, each in its own particular way. And so we have to be able to see our way through all of these waves, understand that they're interconnected, understand that what is at the bottom of all of them is either more social injustice, more division between the haves and the have-nots, or more social justice in all its forms, which is exactly where we need to go. Now, on the health issue, obviously, we need to get to the point, the COVID wave that is already has already taken over many countries, but is still to come in some countries. On that one, we actually have to get to the point where we will be able to live with this disease, not flee from it, because we're not going to magically get rid of it until we have a vaccine, and that's going to take several years. And even when we have a vaccine, there's no magical wand that is going to say, okay, we're going to get rid of this virus. We're going to have to get to the point where we can live from it, with it, and not flee from it, and certainly not die from it. On the economic recovery, I actually don't like the word recovery, because we can't recover to what we had before. It has to be much more of an economic resurgence. Yes, we need all of those jobs recovered and more, but they can't be the jobs in the carbon intensive, socially unjust structure that we used to have. This has got to be a moment where we reinvent labor, where we create more jobs, but much better jobs, more sustainable jobs, more socially just jobs that are going to last longer. That means, of course, retraining. but that's part of the transition that we're in. And on the third wave, climate change, where I would actually include climate change and biodiversity because they are one and the same. Well, this morning we were already told by Diana in certain terms that science is pretty clear about the fact that we have to be at 1/2 the global emissions by 2030 and zero net by 2050. So when you look at these three challenges coming up against us one after the other, you understand that frankly, there's no way that we can deal with them sequentially because we just don't have the bandwidth, we don't have the human bandwidth, we don't have the financial bandwidth, we don't have the attentional bandwidth to take one on and then move on to the next and then move on to the next. The fact is that COVID has been an incredible delivery of lessons for us. And we now understand that we actually have to undertake all of these challenges in an integrated fashion, as Jane has just told us. From COVID, we can actually learn at least, well, many lessons, but I've chosen 6 quick lessons that we can learn from COVID that are applicable to all other global challenges. The first is, if there ever has been a situation in which we have all understood that a global challenge requires both individual action, because otherwise we wouldn't all be here on Zoom. This is our individual action toward that challenge. But it also requires systemic action, what governments and corporations are doing. And so let no one ever tell us that one individual or a collection of individuals have no power over a global challenge. Not true. Look what we're doing right now, and we're all contributing to that challenge. So we need both individual and systemic. Secondly, and we talked about this in the morning, the role of science. Yes, science is back. Whoever took science out of the conversation? Science is back. It is those countries that have been paying more attention to science professionals, to health professionals, that are doing better. Because all of these global challenges have science at their root. So thank heavens for the attention to science. Thirdly, and very linked to science, feminine leadership. It is those countries that are being led by women, New Zealand, Taiwan to begin with, that are actually doing much better. Why? Because we women tend to be better listeners. We tend to be guided by collective wisdom. We tend to listen and ask questions from scientists and from other stakeholders who know more than we do. We tend to be more humble and understand that none of this is going to be done by one person. It's got to be all of us together. The fourth that we have quickly learned is all of us are as threatened as the most vulnerable person. That is true of COVID, because as long as there is one human being that has COVID, all of us are threatened. And that is also true of climate change. There's no such thing as saying, well, I'm not threatened, but you are, or the other way around. The fact is, we are all as threatened, or we're all as vulnerable as the most vulnerable person in all of these global challenges. And as Jane has said, all of this is interconnected. All of it is absolutely interconnected, and hence must be approached and answered in an interconnected fashion, not sequentially. We will not survive if we do it sequentially. Now, of course, none of these challenges are going to have a resolution overnight. All of them are testing our resilience, because it is frustrating. It is frustrating to have a gain here and then 2 losses there, 2 gains here and 1 loss. And this is a back and forth, but it's testing our resilience. We have to stay the course. And what it is doing for us is it is inviting us to rise to our better selves. If this were an easy path out of COVID, out of the economic crisis, out of climate, we would have done it already. This is where we are really honing who we are as human beings and what kind of a society do we want to create, especially for those who will be coming after us. So action in solidarity, out of integrity, and with courage are the three things that I think we absolutely have to commit to. In solidarity with those most vulnerable, out of integrity with ourselves and with our higher selves, and with determined courage, because this is going to take every single ounce of our courage to stay the course. So quite a context, I would say, for us, all of us alive right now. But if we couldn't deal with it, we wouldn't have been dealt it. So here we are, being given the challenge of our times. With that, Jane, I thought we could move to the national, and I'm so glad that we're both together in this conversation, because you are, since you are in the United States, you're so much more aware of what is going on in the United States. And I'm not sure if you can portray that without getting very angry, but you can try, or you can get angry. That's also okay.
Nothing wrong with getting angry.
No.
That was very beautiful what you said, Christiana. Thank you. I'm going to watch the video later and look at it again and listen to it again. You know, right now, because we have a greedy, racist, corrupt administration in the White House, all hope really rests in cities and in states. That's where the work on the climate issue is happening. Very immediately. I mean, it's so true what you said. We can't solve the problems sequentially. They have to be solved together. And we have, you know, the government always says, oh my God, you can't have a Green New Deal because it costs too much money. There's no way we can get all this money. Well, now there are tens of trillions of dollars being spent. And unfortunately, a lot of it is going to big corporations and to the fossil fuel industry. And so there's a lot of organizing happening to try to force the Senate now to pass an act that would get money where it needs to go, and including into clean and sustainable energy factors. But it's really hard. It takes a lot of organizing, and we're doing it. And there's no pathway to get to a green economy, which is what we need in order to protect our climate, without going to a just transition, where workers transitioning off of fossil fuels are paid union wages with benefits in new green jobs, without and also any move to a new economy away from fossil fuels has to take into consideration first the frontline communities, the indigenous lands, so many places always inhabited by people of color. They have to be centered because the climate crisis has had the biggest impact on them. And I think growing numbers of people are understanding that. You know, I'll just give you a few examples of what's happening locally. In Colorado, or statewide, in Colorado, the Labor Environmental Coalition has passed legislation last year establishing a just transition office in the State Department of Labor and Employment. And that office is charged with creating an equitable plan for workers and communities transitioning away from coal mines and fossil fuels. So, you know, there you have it in one state where it's happening. In Maine, the state legislature passed and the governor signed a state level Green New Deal designed to move Maine to a renewable energy economy with the active participation of the state and local labor movement in shaping the legislation. And the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers in California, for instance, and in New York and in Massachusetts, are developing really good apprenticeship programs for workers moving away from fossil fuels, whether it's pipe fitting or electrical work. You know, in California, you can get a solar installation career at $75,000 a year. because there's so much work. Charging stations are going to be needed everywhere for what will be a national fleet of electric cars, buses, and trains. And here in Los Angeles, where I live, there's a really good example. There's a campaign called Jobs for America that's making sure that the manufacturing of electric trains and buses happens here in the United States. But as I've studied this issue of just transitions, which are essential globally, one of the things that I've noticed is everywhere where it's working, what is essential to the success is that the affected communities, the environmentalists, the unions, and government representatives are all at the table from the beginning, not after the fact. They're all part of developing the plan. And, you know, just recently, well, I don't know how recent it is, but this incredible move in Germany to move from coal, off of coal, transitioning, I think, 20,000 workers off of coal into clean energy. I mean, it's just miraculous. And that was because the government and the unions and the communities were at the table doing the planning. So at the state and local levels, things are happening, and hopefully Joe Biden will become the next president. But even if he becomes the president, that 3.5% of us are going to have to be in the streets forcing him to do the right thing. And we have 10 points that we're going to demand of him for the climate that he can do on his own without Congress as an executive action to halt fossil fuel projects. So, you know, there's hope.
Good preparation for November and beyond.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, Jane, I agree with you. Unfortunately, you know, the bad news travels much quicker and to more people than good news. And we've definitely been experiencing that the whole of 2020. But there is actually a lot of very, very positive things going on. Many international institutions have realized that the only way to get out of the COVID crisis and the loss of job crisis and the economic paralysis and deal with climate change is actually to focus these so-called recovery packages that Jane has just alluded to, focus them on what they call a green recovery, to make sure that that money is not going to high carbon assets, high carbon industries, high carbon sectors, but rather that funding is going to the new structure that we want to create. And I was very, very surprised because the IEA, which is the International Energy Agency, that has traditionally been basically putting out the opinion of the fossil fuel industry for years. They were the first ones that came out 2 months ago to say, right, at this crisis moment, we have to turn radically away from fossil fuels to renewable energy. I fell off my chair. I called up, you know, Fatih Birol, the head, and I said, Fatih, this is the you we really love. And he has had such an incredible leadership. His report has just come out last week, giving very, very concrete advice to governments on how to do that. So he's not just preaching at them, he's saying, here is what you can do. These are the policies that you can do to move us beyond fossil fuels into renewable energy. That's the IEA, a typically very, very conservative energy agency and the most authoritative energy voice on the planet. The same thing for the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, led by the wonderful Kristalina Georgieva. Also, right after the COVID crisis, she came out and she said, right, this money that we're going to put in now, that we're going to allow countries to get from us, has to be toward a green recovery. More jobs, more quick, you know, shovel-ready jobs, but they have to be green. And she is actually putting what they call green strings on that funding that is going to those countries. The OECD, which are the industrialized countries, the group of industrialized countries, not all of them, I would say Jane is sitting probably in one that hasn't quite picked this up, but many of them understanding this Certainly the European Union as a group of countries already regulating into their recovery packages that they have to be green. And then independently, the specific countries, Germany, Jane has just, mentioned Germany moving even faster away from coal than they were before. Spain just passed a remarkable law that forces every single penny of the recovery packages to be green. And the reason why they did this, I think this is so fascinating, because we had a conversation with the vice president, who's also the Minister of Ecology, and we asked her, why did Spain do this? Answer: because of our responsibility to the youth. How fantastic, right? That is exactly what Spain has understood, that this is the only way into the future. New Zealand under Jacinta, very, very similar, right? And then my tiny little country of Costa Rica that is not going to save the planet, but that is also a really shining little model for doing things the right way. So it is quite impressive that in the middle of this disaster, with the daily news that we get, that, those of us who still have hair want to rip our hair out. Roshi can't do it anymore. But the fact is, if we turn our attention and very specifically go out there and look for the good news, because you have to look for it, because it's not thrown at you like all the bad news is every day. But if you look for the good news, you see it. And what you then understand is that there is an incredible mixture right now. We are in the middle of a very dramatic transition, and every transition is by definition messy. So if you want to look at the world in one way, you can go out there and get the information, the evidence of, whatever the White House is doing, and you form an opinion of what the reality is. If you want to have a different view, you go out there and you look for the news of these other agencies or countries that are actually doing the right thing, and then you form a different view of your reality. But that's the responsibility that we have. We can't just sit there passively and take in all the bad news and reach the conclusion at the end of the day that everything is going to hell in a handbasket. No, our responsibility is to say, no, we know what the future is that we choose and that we want to give to future generations. And therefore, we're going to actively go and work for it. And we're going to go actively out there and look for evidence, because there is a lot of evidence that we are walking in the right direction. Not quickly enough, because it's messy transition, but there's evidence that we're doing the right thing. It's all up to us. How do we decide which way, where do we want to put our energies? In fact, where do we want to put even our thought energy? The more thought energy we, give to all of the bad news coming out of the dark house, as I call it, because one day the lights will return and it'll be again a White House, but right now it's a pretty dark house. And the more, energy we give to everything that is coming out of there and other countries, Brazil, very sadly, then the more we make that a reality. So it's about how do we choose to view this and what our responsibility is toward that. Which brings us, Jane, to our third part, which is our personal internal groundwork. And I have learned from you, Jane, the concept of embodied activism. And I'm actually not even ashamed to confess publicly that that was not a little mental compartment in my head until I met you. And you opened for me that concept of embodied activism. And I would just love for you to share with us what that is, because it's so powerful.
The idea that I can teach you anything blows my mind.
Oh, no.
But, I think we can all agree that we are all in mourning for the earth. We might not know it consciously. We're grieving for what's been lost and what will be lost, even if we do the right thing right away. Young people are grieving for their uncertain futures, often giving up careers to fight for the planet, and we're afraid. But fear can paralyze us. And we mustn't become paralyzed because we need to act. Action brings hope. Action brings us out of isolation into community. And in community, we can fight to solve the crisis. Last year, I was depressed. I didn't know what to do. I'd done all the individual things to reduce my carbon footprint, but I knew that it wasn't enough, especially because I'm a celebrity. So I have a bigger than normal platform, and I didn't feel I was using it. I heard what Greta Thunberg said. She said, we have to act as if our house is on fire, because it is. She said, this is a crisis. We must hit me like a bolt of lightning. And I moved to DC, Washington, DC. I got in touch with the woman who runs Greenpeace, Annie Leonard, who I admire very much. And with her help, I moved to DC, and we started these weekly Fire Drill Fridays, which were rallies focusing on different aspects of the climate crisis, always followed by acts of nonviolent civil disobedience, which meant that we risked arrest. I've been an activist for over 50 years now, and I have noticed that every time I take my body and I step into activism, despair lifts, it dissipates. And the minute that I took action in DC and did everything I could with my whole body, together with growing numbers of people, which meant there was a community being developed, my despair lifted. See, activism and community can be the antidote to despair. And it's very interesting, the effect of civil disobedience, of getting arrested, because in a way you lose control, your hands are tied up, and you're in the control of the police, and yet it feels empowering. Aligning your whole body with your deepest values is empowering. Now, I'm white and I'm famous, so obviously I was treated differently than I would have been if I had been an African American or a Latino person. I'm well aware of that. But still, I think all of the human beings throughout history that have changed history by engaging in nonviolent disobedience, civil disobedience, have experienced what I'm talking about, this empowering sense when you align your body with your deepest values. And I know that you understand this, Christiana.
Jane, say a little bit more, because align your body with your deepest commitments. But it was just such a big aha moment when I heard you speak about this for the first time, that I would want everyone who's listening here, who are hundreds of people, to really get this concept. Okay, so say more about that, about putting your body, because most of us, here's why I would really invite you to share more, because most of us are gravitate toward starting with our thinking, and you accelerate that whole process, right? It's not that you don't start with your thinking, you go through head, heart, and then body very quickly, and there you are with your body. But I would love you to just share that process with us. Why did you, and this is not the first time, right? You've been doing this your whole life, Jane. Why did you decide to do this? And how did you get to the decision that activism that starts with your head, which is where it starts, because we have to understand the concepts, and certainly is enriched by the heart, that somehow wasn't enough? That you actually had to put yourself physically in the way of harm, in the way of police. By the way, nobody gets arrested with so much beauty, elegance, and grace as Jane Fonda. So if you ever want to see the most beautiful arrest, please do look it up on, on Google. But Jane, please tell us.
Well, I learned from the time that I've spent at Upaya Zen Center with Roshi Joan Halifax, that the mind is also in the body, that it's one thing. And you're only using part of your mind if you're all up here. And we can learn facts. We can learn things only in this part of our mind. And then a moment comes for whatever reason. It can be the right timing. It can be, you know, for example, a lot of people had talked about Greta Thunberg, but it was this book written by Naomi Klein called A Burning Case for the Green New Deal. It's the way she talked about Greta, that Greta's Asperger's, she's autistic. And nobody explained why her Asperger's made her a climate hero. And Naomi talked about how Asperger's causes this laser-like focus where you're not influenced by what other people think. I mean, most of us, we get very upset about, we see a picture of a starving polar bear, and then we start tweeting about whatever, you know, or buying something. People with Asperger's don't do that. And she's a science nerd, Greta. And so when she saw a picture of a starving polar bear and realized, and many other things, because she was studying the science, and realized it's like a train barreling straight at us. And nobody's reacting the way they would. We should, every single minute of every day, people should be talking about what they can do to stop the climate crisis. The way Naomi described that, it went from my head into my body. And I started shaking, and that's when I knew what I was going to do, that I was going to go to DC. You know, it has to descend from my head into my body. And so I have that kind of somatic experience the way a lot of people do, because I have a lot of celebrity friends that got arrested with me, and every one of them spoke to me about how it was a transformative experience for them. But then it's just there's the strategic part of it. I mean, if you look at history, whether it's India's independence because of Mahatma Gandhi's civil disobedience, Martin Luther King and the young Black students sitting in the lunch counter when it was closed to Black people. These are things that wake other people up. So strategically, me and Greenpeace knew that what had to happen, because for 40 years we've petitioned and begged and pleaded and spoken and written books and articles and so forth, and we haven't been listened to. Now is the time we realize where we have to take that next step and put our bodies on the line, which is the only thing that's changed history, right? You've written about this in your new book, which is such a wonderful book. And that has to become the new normal. And so just, you know, strategically, I thought, I'm a almost 83-year-old aging actor from Hollywood. If I come and I start getting arrested, people are going to pay attention. Well, if she can do it, I can do it. And people started coming from all over the country, mostly women, mostly older women, because we don't give a flying anymore. What have we got to lose? So older women become the most fiercest activists. And most of the people who came had never done it before, and they kept coming back because they knew that it was making a difference for them internally and also externally. And it was the civil disobedience, you know, that got the newspapers and television to write about us and make the news of what we were doing all around the world, because we were getting arrested. So I don't know if that answered your question. I don't remember how
that answers my question beautifully. And I believe that Roshi Joan Halifax has also gone to Washington and gotten arrested with you.
Yes, and Heather Toney too.
And indeed, and also has shared with some of us the beautiful experience that it was actually a very beautiful experience to be in that situation and to remain grounded and connected, even of physical containment, just really very beautiful experience. So Jane, I think you've inspired all of us to go and get arrested, but here's the problem. Not all of us will do so with so much elegance and beauty and grace. So how do we do that?
Uh, well, I don't know. I mean, I'd forget about elegance, beauty, and grace. You just do it, and you realize that sometimes you can experience bodily harm. I mean, it's not something you do lightly. It's a very serious act, and you have to. We meditate before we do it. We prepare ourselves because it's a very serious thing to do something that is not legal, knowing that you're probably going to be arrested. You have to be
Prepared.
fully present, you know, and there's just not a lot of opportunities in life these days to be fully present and to align yourself fully with your deepest values. And it's an incredible feeling.
Well, thank you. Thank you for taking us on that little excursion that I know maybe you didn't want to go into that depth, but I just think it's such a, it's so instructive and so
You
inspirational.
about it. I was so surprised to read what you had to say about civil disobedience, you know, because you're a diplomat, you're who you are. And wow, even she is.
Yeah, well, I'm the most undiplomatic diplomat there has ever been. So there you are.
How you're successful.
But I also wanted to compliment Jane, your thoughts on embodied activism by also coming back to the alignment of head, heart, and body, which is where you start from. And because to me, it seems that that alignment is the center from which we will get our constant resilience well, right? We have to be constantly renewing that well of resilience to come back over and over and over again. As you know, this is not a sprint, it's a marathon. And you've been at it for many years, and we will continue to be at it for many years. And it is that alignment between what we think, how we feel, what we feel, and what we do, which is the well of energy that we can always come back to. And for me, for those who know me, you know, I call myself a stubborn optimist, because I think that we need both the optimism and the stubbornness. The optimism, which is not a naive optimism of thinking, well, everything is going to take care of itself. I can just sit here on my couch and play couch potato and things are going to be fine. Well, they definitely are not going to be fine. So it's not a naive optimism. It's very much, and you know, some who are on the call, Rebecca Solnit and Joanna Macy, have different terms for this, but it is the same concept. It is the concept of knowing that we as a collection, all of us together, all of our energies together, we can figure this out. None of us knows how. So this is about reciprocal vulnerability. It is about really being very transparent about the fact that we don't know how to solve this. We don't know what, but we definitely know that together we have the collective wisdom to solve it. And that this is the challenge of this century. And it is the challenge of our generation. This is not for young people to solve. I get quite irate when I hear somebody say, thank God for the young people that are going to solve climate change. No, it's not their responsibility. They will be here when we have the most dramatic impacts of climate change, sadly. But if we wait for them to step up to the decision tables and make decisions, it'll be too late. And they will be in a world of constant destruction and constant misery and deepening misery. So it is for our generation. We are the first generation that has all the science. We have the financing that we need, and we have all the technologies. So it is for our generation to at least bend the curve, at least bend the curve over this decade. We have to bend the curve of emissions and start a completely dramatic and irreversible descent of our emissions. It is up to us to do that. The young people will have their turn and they will have to finish the job, but it's not for them to start the job. We need to do that. And so there is a certain sense of hope, active hope, as my sisters call it, what I call optimism, which is to know that we can't afford the luxury of pessimism, that we actually, or fatalism, that we're not going to do this. We have to hang on to the incredible well that we have because of our alignment, to be able to get to the other side of this challenge. And then I call it stubborn optimism because, well, just because I think it's a fun combination of words, but also because we have to be tenacious about this. We have to be determined. Just because, you know, things don't go our way in the first round, or something happens, we can't just then decide, well, that is too difficult and we're not going to do it. No, we continue along the path. We continue along the path until we are actually out of the darkness and walking into the light. And I totally love a term that was used early this morning about a tapestry. I think it was Wendy who said, it is a tapestry not yet woven. And what I love about that image of a tapestry is, first of all, that it has millions of threads, right? Because a tapestry is that, it's the coming together of all these threads from different perspectives. You have threads that come from one direction, from the other direction. So first of all, there's a collective effort in that tapestry. Secondly, that as these threads come together, they individually, each of those threads don't say anything, but collectively, when they come together, they show a pattern that is not there in the individual effort. It is the interweaving of all of those individual threads, call it all of our individual efforts, that actually result in the beautiful pattern that we want to see. And the third thing that I love about that image is that, yes, it's very true that it is a tapestry not yet woven, because we have never faced all of these challenges, certainly not all of them at the same time. However, it is a tapestry that we are already co-weaving with every decision, with every thought, with every act, with every arrest, with every word that we utter, with everything that we put out into the world. We are already co-weaving that tapestry. And the clearer that we are about the tapestry that we want, we will attract more and more threads that will join us, not in doing exactly what we're doing, but that will complement and enrich the pattern of the tapestry that we want. And the problem, however, with that image is that this is so darn urgent, right? And so that's where I come to try to figure out, what do I do between my impatience and my patience? Because I know that these processes take a long time. You know that. You have been on this for decades, Jane. All of us have. And so we know that this is decadal. But we also know that there is an emergency here, that there is an urgency of action. And that bridging between those two, Jane, is where I come out with your conclusion, which is the only way to bridge urgency and patience, because we have to have a certain healthy dose of necessary patience, is actually to step up and to act. That is how we bridge the urgency or the emergency with the patience and the love and the compassion that we have to have, by deciding what each of us is going to do actively to solve this. And as I say, each of those millions of threads are unique and different, and each of us will uniquely and differently choose how we contribute to the solution. But together, there's a beautiful pattern that is emerging. So I just love that image that came out of the conversation this morning. Jane, I don't know if you want to add anything else, but then we're going to be in the wonderful hands of Heather. Do you want to say any final words?
No, I'd like Heather to join us, and we'll see what comes out from that. Thank you, Christiana.
I can tell you, I have thoroughly been just overwhelmed with all of the conversation. It's beautiful to listen to both of you and to really learn from this experience. And thank you for being here and for doing this today. Thank you to everyone who is joining us. And I have the pleasure of shepherding this conversation. Christiana and Jane, I'm really lucky. I can say I know both of you. Christiana, I know you're a friend of Mom's Clean Air Force. We've worked together and have talked about global climate action summit stuff. And it's been a wonderful journey. And of course, Jane, I could not have had a bigger honor than sharing your birthday with you and speaking in Washington, D.C. and marching alongside you and Roche,
getting arrested.
Gloria Steinman, Dolores Huertas. I mean, it was a beautiful, wonderful day. And this is such
excuse me, I want an invitation like that next time, please.
I still have friends calling me, asking me, how did you get that done? I was like, listen, me and Jane Fonda, we go way back. But it's beautiful, and it's beautiful that we can have this conversation. I just want to sort of jump right in because we're talking about some things that are very important here in the United States this weekend. It's Juneteenth. We have celebrated African-American liberation and also delayed justice for the African-American community. We have been talking about protests. We've been talking about what is happening across our country and really across our globe. And then how does all of this intersect with climate? And how does it intersect with climate right now for all of us? And I appreciate you ladies for talking about this from a perspective of both an international state and even digging down into the personal. Jane, I remember you speaking after we had the Fire Drill Friday there in DC, and one of the things you said, you were so excited that your granddaughters actually came and they were arrested with you, and that was their embodied action, and just seeing that generational divide really come and be bridged together through your own family is certainly what we talk about in Moms all the time, is why we're doing this for the sake of our children. And our children, my children, are Black children. And it's important for me to have this conversation in the scope of all children. But let's get to that, because that at this place in our history is a problem. One of the things that we've got to figure out how to do, and I'd love to hear this from you, Christiana, from a global perspective, and Jane, you can talk about it from a national perspective, but how do we build this trust, right? How do we build this trust among women to say that you understand where I'm coming from, you understand my place and what this means for me? Because environmentalism and putting my body on the line looks different for different people in different places. There are Black and brown people in the Southeast where I'm from Mississippi, who can tell you we've been putting our bodies on the line for years, for generations. Now I need to trust you because we are running out of time. And we really have to build, I think, a bond with one another to be able to share stages, share the mic, to be able to really elevate these issues so that we can have culturally competent solutions. Mm-hmm. How do we do that? What has been your experience? You're both very internationally known women. How have you done that? Jane, go ahead.
Well, for a long, long time, I thought, well, I'm not racist. I worked with the Black Panthers a lot. I have a daughter, an adopted daughter, whose parents were part of the Black Panthers. But when Trump was elected, And I saw the incredible backlash, the hatred people had, the anger that Obama, a Black man, had been president of the United States. And the presence of white supremacy became so much more evident than I had thought it was. I said, well, clearly there's something wrong because I don't understand enough of what's happened. I may say that I'm not racist, but I have to do more than that. I have to become an anti-racist. And that means stepping into action. But first I have to study. So I've spent the last 3.5 years reading every book that I thought would be important about racism, slavery, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, the new Jim Crow, a lot of biographies of Black people, so that I could really understand from a historical point of view and from a personal point of view, reading the biographies of people who were living through it, to understand race in this country. And then that led me to an understanding that what big corporations in the fossil fuel industry are doing to the earth is the same as what they did to indigenous people when they committed genocide and stole the land from the indigenous people that were already here, and when they brought people from Africa and called them not human. Because if they were not human, then they could justify, well, this is a democracy, everyone is equal, and those people aren't human, so that doesn't count. So it gave me a different understanding about the founding of this country, the history of this country, and how that mentality is the same mentality that's destroying the planet. And that's why, though a majority of African American and Latinx people in this country care more about the planet than white people do. Everybody thinks that, you know, that it's
people
white
don't know
movement.
that.
It's not
Right.
true. No, research has been done. And there's a reason for it, because I learned this during the Fire Drill Fridays, when we would have people coming from frontline communities that just staggered me what I heard and just broke my heart. What people are living through, people of color, because of the climate crisis and because of the fossil fuel industry. So to me, they are, for the last 3 weeks, we've been turning our Fire Drill Fridays to the issue of George Floyd's murder and police violence and the Black movement for Black lives here in this country. And it doesn't seem that we're turning away from climate. It seems very much integrated. And I just think white people have to understand white privilege, which I am trying to do, again, by reading, understand the history of racism in this country, and then do something. Join the protests, have Black friends so that you can understand from them the reality. But then also, when you vote, understand that there are systems, there are policies in place that maintain slavery, redlining, mortgage issues, banking issues, making it impossible, for example, for Black people to accumulate wealth that white people can do. So we have to understand the structures that maintain racism and do away with them. And I talked about getting arrested and spending the night in jail and everything like that. I understand why Black.
Did we get a freeze there?
Did we lose Jane?
I don't know. We may have lost Jane for a second. She may be coming back on.
I don't want to say she's frozen, but and she was right in the middle of an incredibly important point.
Oh, there she is. Okay, she was frozen there for a second. Go ahead.
Jane, you just
were right in the middle of saying.
We missed it. You have to go back, reel back about 3 lines.
What did I say?
Really important.
You were saying why Black people, and then you were talking about being arrested.
Oops, did we lose
she may have a little challenge there. you know, I could feel her passion.
Her passion, you know, the Wi-Fi just can't take her passion. There she is.
That's what it is. That's what it is. And yeah, I was gonna say, well, oh, is she back? There we go. Jane, are you back? There you go. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know when you lost me or when I got lost.
You were talking about how passionate you were about, how when Black people are arrested and then you cut out. So we would love you to pick up right there.
I mean, it changed history.
Mm-hmm.
It forced the reality of the violence and the racism in the South onto the minds of everybody that didn't really realize it before. And and I was just saying that I understand why Black people have a different relationship with the police than I might. And so while it's easier for me to risk arrest, it's very different for Black people. And that's why fewer Black people have engaged in that with me. And I understand.
Yes. You know, it's interesting because we had that conversation when we were preparing to march. And I think I was sharing with you, and I know I was sitting next to Roshi Joan, just how, the weekend before Christmas, one of my fears and concerns was whether or not I would be able to get out and go home. I know, the white people would, but when it came to me getting arrested in Washington, D.C., I was under a different likelihood. And so just the idea of that, I appreciate the realness of that moment and you honoring that moment and honoring what I had to think through there. And I think that's what makes this important, for all of us to really embody in this moment, is when we're talking about these social justice actions, is how it feels differently. But Christiana, I want you to talk about the international aspect of that, because we don't often connect to our brothers and sisters in India, in Europe, in Africa that are dealing with some very similar environmental issues, but there's a disconnect in the experience of what we're feeling. Can you talk a little bit more about what you have experienced and seen internationally and how that relates to what we're dealing with now?
Yeah. I actually think, Heather, that is, for me anyway, the most difficult part of working on climate change, because I may look white because I have European parents, but I come from Costa Rica, that is in a developing country. And so on climate change, on the global issue, the arguments and the reality is divided smack down the middle. Industrialized countries on one side and developing countries on the other side. Why? Because climate change has been caused by the burning of fossil fuels in industrialized countries primarily. And that's not ideology, that's not a myth, that's simply a mathematical, physical fact. It's a historical fact that no one can deny. Now, I'm not saying that it was intentionally done. No one in the North intentionally burned fossil fuels and caused climate change. There's no intent, but it was an unintended consequence. And it is also an unintended but deplorable consequence that it is those in developing countries who are the most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. Why? Because there are less financial resources to be able to adapt to all of that destruction that is coming upon us, because women are less empowered and have less capacity to bring their families along in very, very difficult circumstances. And because those are the countries that are only beginning, in the best of all cases, to come out of extreme poverty. Some are still in extreme poverty, even in the year 2020, which is completely unacceptable. But even in the 2020, we still have countries or populations in countries that are still in extreme poverty. And therefore, climate change or COVID or the economic paralysis, or anything else that we want to look at, hits those people the most. Who are those people? People of color, right? And so that's where there's an overlay with a very different history to the internal history of the United States, but an overlay of those who are more privileged or who have taken more advantage of the Industrial Revolution benefits, versus those who haven't been able to take advantage of the Industrial Revolution benefits. And not only did they not take advantage of them, but now they're suffering the consequences. So it's a double whammy, right? A double whammy. And it's one of the most, or it is honestly the most difficult issue for me for the following reason, Heather. Because I sit on the verge of two chairs, or in between two chairs, on how do I think about this. On the one hand, there is what we call historical responsibility, which is the responsibility on the shoulders of industrialized countries. And I am, a fervent emphasizer of historical responsibility that cannot be denied. At the same time, Heather, I don't, in my personal experience, when I lift a finger and blame someone else, I don't really get very much out of it. And so while historical responsibility is there, to move from that which is a fact, which is historical responsibility, to then blame and engage in what I think is a very dangerous victim-perpetrator dynamic, I just don't think that it serves us well. Because the moment that you get into that victim and perpetrator dynamic, it's very difficult to get out of it. Yeah. And those who are perpetrators don't want to be called perpetrators. Those who are victims will push themselves further into that hole, which is the last thing that we want. And so for me, I'm trying to deal with two realities at the same time. One is undeniable historical responsibility, and the other, which seems to contradict, but I'm working for it not to contradict in my reality, is the shared responsibility that we all have toward the future. And in fact, the shared responsibility that we all have toward the most vulnerable. That is not a responsibility of industrialized or developing countries. That's a responsibility of everyone. Every single human being has that responsibility, which doesn't deny historical responsibility. It's a shared responsibility toward the future. But that responsibility toward the future, as long as it's shared by all of us, and if it's shouldered more by those who can do more, then I think that is a way forward. In my personal experience as an individual, but also at a systemic experience, I have a very hard time figuring out how does lifting a finger and blaming, even if it's justified, and it's almost always justified, how does that help me get out of the hole or help the other person get out of the hole? Because ultimately, the question that we have to ask is, do we want to be right or do we want well-being? And for me, I would rather have well-being for all and forget about who's right and who's wrong. But I would rather put my energy towards shared well-being.
Yeah, you make such an important point that I think we're all grappling with right now. It's number one, it's hard. It's just hard. It's hard, and we are on a time clock. Jane said that at the very beginning. You just look at the amount of time we have left to make these decisions. We're running out of time every single day. And that process of, I think, doing the work, which you both have obviously done and are continuing to do, is that recognition of the pain that I think victims do feel, as well as figuring out how we're going to build this trust to get us to the next place. Now, there are two things that I really want you to dig into here, because I think it's fascinating in this discussion. Both mentioned women as leaders, and you both are women who are leaders in this space. And I can't help but notice that when looking at COVID the coronavirus in our country, police brutality in our country, and the response that has taken place in the United States, that Black women, women of color, have been owning it. I mean, now I've got a little bias because I'm a former mayor. So when I look and I see the mayor of Chicago and San Francisco and Atlanta and New Orleans, you know, and mayors all across this country who are women, who are stepping up and really leading at this time in this space, I'm smiling because it gives me hope. At the same time, I know we have to encourage women to step into these leadership positions. How are you doing that in your spaces? And how and what words of wisdom or encouragement could you give to people who are listening and watching to say, your time is now to step into this space, be it on a global or a local level?
Well, Jane is all about that. So Jane, you go first.
I couldn't agree with you more, Heather, about Black women being in leadership. A couple, maybe 4 years ago, I got some leaflets in the mail about self-care, how organizers and activists need to care for themselves. And it came from the movement, it came from Black Lives Matter. And I was just shocked because in all the years that I've been an activist, I don't remember any organization that's sent out these kind of flyers. And that's when I found out it's led by women, Black queer women who talk about intersectionality. They understand the issues on so many different levels. And I personally think that's one reason why the protests right now in the United States are different. There's a different, the ether around them is different. And I think it's because they are led by queer Black women and it's more welcoming. I mean, anyway, that's not to criticize Black men, but it's just that, you know, women think more about our health, our bodies, how we feel, taking care. We are caregivers. And I mean, I think I have a book coming out on September 8th called What Can I Do? And I write a lot in it about why I think women are in the leadership of the climate movement and why we are so much less vulnerable to the disease of individualism. And so I think it makes a real difference when it's a circular leadership as opposed to a hierarchical leadership. This shape is the problem. This is white supremacy. There is always a cisgender white man at the top. That's what has to change. Women are circular. I think it goes all the way back to hunter-gathering days when we sat in circles around the fire and took care of each other's children and depended on each other for survival. So I just think that the Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black Lives now is showing the way to get more women involved because they feel safer, because they feel more included. And my way of doing it is simply to lead by example. Well, if she can do it, I can do it. And that, you know, I'd like to know what you think, Christiana.
Well, Jane, I have a little domestic problem now because I have a hole in my ceiling. I have a daughter who leads women's circles and who trains women to lead women's circles. And when she heard you say circular leadership and circles of women, she jumped up and down and made a hole in my ceiling. So I have a little domestic problem here with my neighbor upstairs that I'm going to have to fix up. But I can't agree more with both of you. It is truly, it is a very, very different kind of leadership. And you know why? I don't know. I wish we didn't fall into this simplistic thinking of, you know, well, we're the ones who bear the children and therefore we are much closer to legacy and to stewardship and to long-term thinking. But maybe that's it. Maybe it is as simple as that. We are the ones, you know, that bear the children, that accompany those children for the first 9 months and the rest of their lives. And we tend to be deeper listeners than our men. We tend to look longer term. We tend to collaborate more. We tend to have smaller egos. I mean, it's just, you know, it all sounds very simplistic and almost irresponsible that, you know, that it comes down to those factors, but maybe it is. Maybe that's why, which, as Jane says, it doesn't mean that men don't have that, because they also have a lot of the divine feminine in them if they want to express it and if they want to touch it. It just means that we come perhaps more naturally to it. And what I think is just incredibly exciting is that the next generation, my daughter's generation, have just grown up with that as being the normal. That is the normal for them. They have no idea of the struggles of previous generations. It's just, that's the way it is for them. They totally understand that this is the moment of the divine feminine in both men and women, in both of them. And I just think, you know, it's so comforting to know that there is a maturing of humanity, and that we are maturing toward understanding different kinds of organizations, different kinds of leadership, and evolving leadership and thinking and collaboration, evolving it toward the structures and the principles that we need to solve these huge challenges, because we definitely aren't going to solve climate change like this, to use Jane's, you know, finger thing. We're not going to solve COVID like this. We're not going to solve, we can't. It's got to be a very, very different form of thinking and of working with each other. And so I don't put the responsibility on young people at all, but I'm very comforted to know that they are pushing us in that direction and accelerating that transformation for all of us.
Jane, you had something to follow with that? Go ahead.
I love this quote that comes from Gloria Steinem. It's not that women are morally better than men. We just don't have our masculinity to prove. One thing about how the COVID pandemic is playing out in North America is so patriarchal. The proving of masculinity. Don't tell me what to do. Don't tell me I have to wear a mask. You know what I mean? That's what it is. And I think it's one reason why women live longer than men. You know, we has always been a threat to man's eye. Whereas for women, our eye has always been porous. You know, we've always, you know, tended to work collectively. But, you know, one of the biggest challenges right now is climate, as you said, Christiana, the climate crisis, just like COVID, is a collective crisis. And it requires a collective solution. And this is coming at a time when the notion of the collective, of the common, of the public sphere, of civil society is being destroyed. It started in the 80s with Reaganism and Thatcherism. I mean, even Thatcher said there is no such thing as society. Why do they do this? Deliberately trying to do away with with the common. It's because when we are a collective, we are powerful. As individuals, we lack power. You know, the Vietnamese always said, once there's the oak and there's a bamboo. One bamboo isn't as strong as the oak. But if you take a bundle of bamboos and tie them together, they're stronger than any oak tree. And I think that's true. We have to rebuild community, which is what we are doing. It's what Black Lives Matter is doing. It's what the movement for Black Lives is, what the climate movement is doing. We're building community. We have to stay together and love and support each other, and that's how we're gonna beat this.
And, you know, Heather, this term, the tragedy of the commons, that we all grew up with and were educated with, yes, there's a certain logic to that. But I think that in the evolution of humankind, we're at the point in which we are transforming the concept of the tragedy of the commons to the concept of the infinite possibility of the shared, or the infinite possibility of the common. Very, very different concept. If we are led in our life by the tragedy of the commons, no one is going to do anything about anything. That is not going to take us forward. But if we are led by the infinite possibility of the common, nothing can stand in our way. There is nothing that we cannot do. And we are on a path to understanding and practicing that.
Yes, yes. We have just 2 minutes left. We have to ask both of you, what is next for you?
Well, I want to get arrested with Jane. And then I am in the throes of still germinating the idea. I'm living in Costa Rica now. I've finally come home after 46 years of living in every other country of the world except my own. And I'm germinating the idea of a little center. It's definitely not going to be the size of the Upaya Center. A little center for training of women leadership, starting from our spiritual roots. And really making sure that leadership is rooted in spiritual understanding, whichever path you want to choose. I'm totally open for you to choose whichever path, but make sure that leadership is not a leadership that is unrooted and that will then fly with the first gust of wind, but rather a leadership that is firmly rooted in the truths that we all know.
Thank you, Jane.
Well, I'm almost 83 years old and I have a compromised immune system, which means that I can't join the protests, which is just eating away at me. So I'm spending most of my time online, organizing online. And we have thousands of volunteers for Fire Drill Friday that will, in many different ways, have an impact on the election. That to me is the most important thing. I have a book coming out in September, which I'm going to use the promotion of the book to try to organize and get out the climate vote. And so it's, you know, I'm pretty much absorbed by what's coming on in November with the election, because we have to win this election, and yes, we have to convince everybody that can vote to vote.
Yes,
absolutely. Absolutely. I could not agree more. Thank you, Christiana. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Roshi, for allowing me to shepherd this beautiful conversation. And to everyone who has been here, this has been a joy and a pleasure. And I look forward to continuing and hearing from all of you. This is beautiful.